Americans have, in recent years, been fond of boasting that, unlike most nations, where it is heritage, history, and race that bind people, the United States is a place that one can belong to regardless of background. That is true enough, but there is a reason most countries are not multi-ethnic, and why most of those that have tried to become multi-ethnic have failed. Where a shared heritage is absent or unrecognized, as it is in the contemporary United States, all the eggs of national cohesion are placed in the basket of the Constitution. Thus, we have a paradox. With the dawn of the Civil Rights era, the U.S. Constitution, the very thing that made it possible for an ethnically varied nation to live together, came to stress. Certainly, many white people did wish for the Civil Rights Revolution. In the last summer of JFK's life, a plurality of 49 to 42% said they favored a law that would give all persons the right to be served in public places such as hotels, restaurants, theaters, and similar establishments. 5 months after pushing the Civil Rights Act through Congress, Lyndon B. Johnson would win the presidency with an incredible 61% of the popular vote. In the next midterm election, Democrats would lose 47 House seats, however, making the 1964 landslide look less like a validation of Johnson than a tribute to JFK. In an address to Congress, Johnson told the representatives, "No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long." In August 1963, the month of the March on Washington and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, 50% of the country believed America was moving too fast on integration, according to a Gallup poll where only 10% believed integration was proceeding not fast enough, a ratio of 5 to 1. In 1964, on the eve of the Civil Rights Act, only 16% of Americans said that mass demonstrations had helped the cause of racial equality, versus 74% who said they heard it. 60% even disapproved of the March on Washington, and less than a quarter approved of it. Americans also told Gallup that the blacks in their community had the same opportunities as white children to get a good education, by a margin of 83%. Most Americans, liberal and conservative, saw the race problem as something distant, something that only concerned the American South, like a matter of foreign policy. The sociologist of race, Alan David Freeman, wrote of how, sitting in an all-white, 5th grade classroom in New York City, he had found out about the Brown decision. "I can recall distinctly the response of my own naively liberal consciousness. The law is now going to make those bad Southerners behave." It is clear most whites had not thought much about what it would be like to live in close proximity to blacks, if indeed they even thought that this would be the result of civil rights legislation at all. White people knew a lot less about black people than blacks did about white people. The mostly northern whites who legislated against Jim Crow saw themselves as making a grand and magnanimous gesture, cutting a heroic figure. Black people, and the most zealous among the civil rights activists, saw whites as having entered a guilty plea in the court of history, and thus repudiating the moral posturing on which the good name and the good conscience of their constitutional republic had rested. When the pollsters looked, they discovered that black views were in most cases the opposite of whites. 60% of blacks believed progress on civil rights was too slow, by 69 to 9%. Blacks reckoned federal anti-poverty programs a boost rather than a hindrance. When the riots came to the big cities and college campuses, blacks leaned toward thinking they helped more than hurt racial integration compared to whites, who believed by over 70% that the opposite was true. 2 weeks after Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, black 15-year-old James Powell was shot in Harlem. Harlem exploded into riots, which lasted 6 nights, one of which saw 200 police and civilians hospitalized. No sooner had they ended than Rochester, New York blew up. Jersey City, Philadelphia, and Dixmoor, Illinois followed. Many American race riots in the half-century that followed, from Watts in 1965 through Los Angeles in 1992 to Ferguson in 2014 and Baltimore in 2015, would take the form of Harlems in 1964. To part of the country, the riots were a social movement. To the rest, the riots were just crime. Starting in the 1960s, an astonishing spike of similar criminal acts, in which blacks made up a disproportionate share of both perpetrators and victims, took on aspects of a national emergency. This includes the looting episodes in Memphis that preceded the assassination of MLK and the deadly riots that followed it, the Attica prison revolt of 1971, the New York blackout of 1977, the crack epidemic of 1986, the LA Rodney King riots of 1992, and O.J. Simpson's acquittal in his 1995 murder trial. Even today, blacks cause a disproportionate amount of crime in modern-day America. Meanwhile, while the legislation of the 1960s made legal equality a fact in American life, the advance in blacks' fortunes slowed after 1964. The country was left looking for excuses. Every corner of American political culture would be affected by the effort to explain that failure away. The civil rights movement did not disband, instead, it grew. Section 706G of the Civil Rights Act allowed the government to compel affirmative action, ordering the hiring of black people, or any other equitable relief as the court deems appropriate. The act had opened almost all American businesses to lawsuits for discrimination. In 1971, in Griggs v. Duke Power Company, the Supreme Court asked whether a power plant in North Carolina could give aptitude tests to its employees. Chief Justice Warren Burger and a unanimous court decided they could not, if such tests disadvantaged blacks in any way. Good intent, or absence of discriminatory intent, does not redeem employment procedures or testing mechanisms that operated as built-in headwinds for minority groups. The government was now authorized to act against racism even if there was no evidence of any racist intent. At the simplest level, the term affirmative action meant discarding prevailing notions of neutrality in order to redistribute educational and employment chances on the basis of race. That is not how civil rights had been sold to the American public. Americans who felt that civil rights were justified by an especially shameful history also thought that it was limited by that history. Just half a decade into the Civil Rights Revolution, America had something it had never had at the federal level, something the overwhelming majority of its citizens would never have approved, an explicit system of racial preference.